It's been a one-sided affair between the South Carolina Gamecocks and the Missouri Tigers over the past couple years, and not necessarily in South Carolina's favor. How should Gamecock and Tiger fans view this game heading into the 2024 season? John Miller of Locked On Mizzou and myself will talk about all of that on today's Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Mizzou podcasts.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation and Tiger Nation, and welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks and the Locked On Mizzou podcast. In this case, it is a crossover edition between both shows. We, of course, cover both of your teams every single day. I am Locked On Gamecocks host Andrew Lyon. Pleased to be joined by Locked On Mizzou host John Miller to talk about South Carolina's football matchup with Missouri Tigers that will be taking place later this fall, and giving fans sort of an idea of what to expect from both teams and maybe some things to look at with that matchup upcoming. John, how have you been doing this week?
Doing fantastic. I'm excited to talk some football with you, Brandon. I think we got an interesting matchup that maybe some Missouri fans are overlooking a little bit.
Yeah, no, and that last part, what you just said there, John, I think is a perfect segue into sort of the beginning of this show, which is going to talk about sort of the dynamic of this series. You know, for a good while when Missouri joined the SEC, John, it was a really good back and forth affair between both of these programs, and honestly, kind of one of the more underrated games in SEC play year in and year out. But I have to say at this point, that hasn't really been the case over the past 4 or 5 years. It's become more of a one-sided affair in favor of the Missouri Tigers. And last season, John, in all honesty, is the first time that I can recall where South Carolina fans coming into the game against Missouri, they really didn't expect to win this game. You know, the previous 3 or 4 years, and all fan bases are like this, you'll find some reason and or excuse, or maybe both in certain cases, why maybe you lost the game, why maybe you lost a couple games in a row. But once it gets to about 4 or 5 wins, and last year Missouri won by 22 points, the largest margin of victory in the series history up to this point, there's no denying it anymore. At this point, you've accepted it that Missouri is the better team right now between both these programs. So, John, how do Missouri fans view this game coming off of what all happened last season, both within the game, but also the entire season as a whole?
Well, it's interesting. You know, from my perspective, certainly Missouri on paper should be the favorite in this ball game. But, you know, traveling to Columbia, South Carolina, never an easy place to play. By the way, I'm going to be traveling to this game as well. That's going to be my road trip for this fall. So that should be a good time. Looking forward to checking the whole thing out.
Yeah.
But I think it's a real big mistake if Missouri fans are assuming a victory here. South Carolina is not the type of team you can just roll into, especially in their place, and expect a win. Now, what both of these teams will be looking like on November 16th is, of course, anybody's guess at this point. Again, I think Missouri should be favored, but at the same time, that's a real possible trap game. I really believe that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the possibility of this being a trap game. You know, you look at the schedule dynamic, and it does say that, you know, South Carolina, they may have an advantage in that regard. They play at Vanderbilt the week before, which I've mentioned before. That's almost the closest thing to a third bye week in this season as you can get here in the SEC, and then they play an FCS school in Wofford the week after this game against Missouri. Then for the Tigers, they play an intriguing game against Oklahoma at home the week before this game against South Carolina. Definitely heard a lot of talk about, you know, the back and forth between Missouri and Sooner fans on X, on all the types of social media this offseason, so I'm sure that's going to be an emotionally charged game. And then you got to play a tricky road game at Mississippi State, kind of same deal as South Carolina, you know, more talented than them, but hey, Mississippi State, they're going to definitely play their butts off to try to defend their home turf as well. So when you take that into account, John, you know, what are your overall thoughts on the schedule dynamic aspect of this game?
Well, I'll just say this. I agree with you. It could be worse, though, for Missouri. I think one thing that helps them out a lot there is you have back-to-back games in Tuscaloosa and then home against Oklahoma. Fortunately, Missouri does have a bye week sandwiched between those two games, so that comes at kind of the perfect time for the Tigers. The schedule really did fall nicely. Now, if you look at the projections for Missouri's schedule this year, they have the easiest schedule projected in the SEC, but that also makes it like 26th or 7th overall in the country. So I do think maybe a little bit more has been made of that than it should be so far.
Yeah, and the other intriguing aspect about this game is sort of the changing narratives between both head coaches. You look at Shane Beamer and Eli Drinkwitz heading into the 2023 season, John, the narrative was kind of in reverse. Shane Beamer was the one that was getting a lot of flowers from people across the league and even nationally after how the Gamecocks ended the 2022 season, and Drinkwitz was a guy where we were sitting here asking, hey, if he has a bad season, if maybe they go 6-6 or maybe 5-7, does he even keep his job at this point? And then Drinkwitz turns around and has the best season by far of his young head coaching career to this point. So what are your thoughts on sort of the storyline surrounding that? Now this is sort of a game where, hey, Drinkwitz, he might not need this game quite as much as he needed the last couple years, whereas Shane Beamer, this might be a game he has to win just to make it back to the postseason in order to avoid missing out on a bowl game 2 years in a row.
No doubt job security wise, I think now the dynamics have changed for Drinkwitz totally. He doesn't need the South Carolina game at all for job security purposes at this point. That he's secure. He's got an extension. He's making $9 million a year now at this point. He's going to be okay. But in terms of the college football playoff, Missouri, I think their goal is very clear. It's to make the 12-team playoff. I think they're going to have to go 10-2 to do it. It's kind of hard to see Missouri doing that if they lose to South Carolina. Not impossible, but that's where it is more of a must-win game. So if you think this is a game Missouri's looking past, I definitely wouldn't go that far. But to your point, Andrew, I've thought it's been very interesting. Going back all the way to last offseason, I was even kind of cautioning some of your listeners saying, hey, this is very much like year one Drinkwitz, all right? You over exceeded expectations a little bit. Now year two, well, same thing for Missouri. You had a bit of a step back. Now year three, people are going, oh, what do we have in this guy? Sort of like Dennis Gates, by the way, the basketball coach, to an even more extreme example, by the way. But right. I just think it's really interesting. What can South Carolina do here in year three? Year three for Missouri, they still had kind of that 6-6 type season, but you saw some steps forward. You saw things beyond just the box score and the final score of that game. So I guess what I'm telling South Carolina fans, I was kind of cautioning maybe a little bit to the optimistic side. Now I'm saying don't get too pessimistic. Give Beamer a chance. Even if this season is slightly below your expectations, look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, John, it is really funny how recency bias plays such a massive role in how we view all of these coaches and all of these teams. Again, just this past offseason, South Carolina was a team that was getting a lot of attention, and now, obviously, they missed out on a bowl game. They definitely had a disappointing season. I think Shane Beamer would admit that himself if we had him on the show right now. But now it's kind of like Carolina's being overlooked. They brought in a top-notch transfer portal class, a top 20 high school class, new quarterback Lenore Sellers. Sure, he might not have quite the arm talent that Spencer Rattler has, but people think that he could be a really good quarterback down here. And just because of what happened last year, that's all kind of being brushed under the rug, so to speak. So obviously, a lot of time before this game takes place, and who knows, by that point, maybe things are a little bit different as far as the talking points regarding both of these teams in a positive way. But for Gamecock fans that are maybe interested about what the Tigers could look like heading into this season, some pieces come back, some really big ones, but also a couple of big losses at key spots. So how could the Tigers be trying to fill in maybe a couple of those voids that they have? John will tell us about all of that in a few moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Mizzou. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is the formula for winning championships and also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to this crossover edition between the Locked On Gamecocks and the Locked On Mizzou podcast, where we cover the South Carolina Gamecocks and Missouri Tigers every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks or Locked On Mizzou podcast your first choice for South Carolina Gamecock and Missouri Tiger sports coverage. All right, John, let's talk a little bit about what is going on up in Columbia, Missouri. As the Tigers, they bring back a big piece at the quarterback position in Brady Cook, a guy that showed a lot of improvement in 2023, threw for 578 more passing yards on 14 less attempts compared to 2022, along with 7 more touchdowns and 1 less interception. So a lot more efficient, a lot more big plays coming from Brady Cook's arm. You know, it seemed like that him recovering from that injury he suffered in 2022, I believe it was a shoulder injury, if I recall correctly, it helped him out a great deal. So with all that being said, John, what is the next step for Brady Cook as he prepares to head into his third season as the starter up there in Missouri?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think maybe the improvements from 22 to 23 are maybe even more pronounced than what those total statistics would lead you to believe, quite honestly. But yeah, big time, the labrum surgery that he had. He played basically 10 and a half weeks of the season with an injured labrum in his right throwing shoulder. So that had a big effect on Brady. But, you know, I think for him to take the next step this season, what I think Brady is good at already, I think he's good at distributing those short passes around the line of scrimmage. You see a lot of that in the Kirby Moore offense. Then you also see a lot of deep balls as well, a lot of deep shots down the field. And I think Brady really improved with deep ball accuracy, just off play action passes and that kind of stuff. He had some really nice slot fade patterns to Luther Burden for touchdowns in the Vanderbilt game. I'm just remembering off the top of my head here. I think for Brady to take the next step, it's maybe hitting more of those intermediate shots, those balls, 10 to 20 yards downfield. I think Missouri's tight end, Brett Norfleet, who was a true freshman last season, I think you saw him come on a little bit more as the season went along in the passing game. I think if you see more of that, Norfleet can be a big part, especially of opening up that intermediate middle part of the field for the Missouri offense. So to me, especially in the passing game, that's the next step.
Yeah, you mentioned those slot fade routes earlier that Brady Cook threw last season, and I got to say that was the thing that definitely stood out to me the most. I watched the LSU-Missouri game while I was at the beach at that point in the season, and it was just impressive to me how he was spotting the football and basically putting it right in the breadbasket. So Brady Cook definitely a big part of that offense last year. And another person that was a big part of that offense was running back Cody Schrader. I think he was the leading rusher in the SEC. Certainly came onto the scene. Not a lot of people, I think, expected him, maybe even some Missouri fans, to have the season that he had this past fall. You lose him, he goes on to the NFL. And I know, John, if there's one position that the Tigers have been really good at sort of replenishing the last few years, it has been running back, to be fair. But obviously, with everything Cody Schrader did, maybe even setting up the passing game a little bit because of how great he was in that zone run game, what are the Tigers looking to do to try to maybe fill in that void at that running back spot?
Well, Eli Drinkwitz loves to just use one running back for the most part, and he loves experience at most positions, but especially at the quarterback and the running back position. So what did Missouri do? They went into the transfer portal, added a couple guys with a lot of experience. Marcus Carroll, a 4-year player at Georgia State. They also got Nate Noel, who was somewhat coincidentally from Drinkwitz's old stomping grounds of App State. I think Carroll is sort of a little bit different of a runner than Missouri has had in recent years, at least a little bit different of a scheme style. He was more of a sort of straight vertical type runner, just straight ahead, at least in the scheme that he was running. What do they see in him? We'll see. They think he can probably translate to Missouri's outside zone heavy scheme that Schrader was so good at. I think Nate Noel in particular, his scheme was more similar to what Missouri ran last season. So I think what you're going to see, more than likely one of those two guys is probably going to take the lion's share of the carries and snaps in general at running back, because even on third downs, Missouri generally likes to just have one guy in there for, say, 85-90% of the important snaps. But like you say, Andrew, Missouri under Drinkwitz has done a nice job of manufacturing a running game, no matter if it's Tyler Beatty or Cody Schrader or Larry Roundtree. So I'm fairly confident that Missouri is going to be okay at the running back spot.
Yeah, and Marcus Carroll was actually one of those portal running backs where if South Carolina had not gone after and landed Raheem Rocket Sanders out of Arkansas, he was another guy that Gamecock fans were kind of hoping that they would pursue. So I think it's fair to say that at the very least with Carroll, I think y'all definitely landed a really good portal running back there. And at least one of those two guys, like you mentioned, will probably step up to the plate for the Tigers this fall. And then one other person I want to talk about, not a player, but on the coaching side, is defensive coordinator Blake Baker. I know that Missouri basically did everything within their power to try to hold on to him, but LSU came calling this offseason. I believe maybe his wife actually went to school down there in the state of Louisiana, and so the family pull was just probably a bit too much to overcome there with Blake Baker. He heads on to Baton Rouge, and obviously he's been a big piece of the success the Tigers have had the past couple years, John. So what are things looking like on the defensive side of the ball heading into a year where the Tigers are looking to capitalize on the momentum that they built up last year?
Well, as we were just talking about running back on the offensive side of the ball, really that's about my only question mark, because the quarterback's back, the pass receivers are back. Missouri did, I think, a nice job of plugging the two holes that they needed to replace at offensive line. Defense is a whole completely different story. A really good Missouri defense the past couple seasons. Blake Baker deserves a lot of credit for that, for sure. And Missouri obviously wanted Baker back. They offered him a very strong offer of maybe possibly a little bit over $2 million a year. Ultimately, LSU gets it done with $2.5 million. And again, probably the ties to LSU. A somewhat surprising move to me. We don't have to get into that. The point is, again, new defensive coordinator. The two cornerbacks both were drafted into the NFL. Darius Robinson, a first-round pick as an edge rusher. Those are some really big pieces for Missouri to replace. I think they like some of the guys they brought in the portal for sure. But you know what? You do have to be somewhat skeptical about the Missouri defense until you see it. Corey Batoon, the new defensive coordinator. How's it going to all work? All I've seen is the spring game where you couldn't even tackle so far. So I'm not going to make a lot of judgments there. To me, it's just an unknown. I'm not saying I'm confident or skeptical, really. I'm just saying it's an unknown.
Yeah, and that's absolutely more than fair. And, it might be a good time for Missouri to have maybe one of the quote-unquote easier schedules in the SEC because of the fact that, there are maybe some skepticism or there's some question marks to be had on one side of the ball that has been so pivotal for the Tigers over the past couple years. So what could Missouri do this upcoming season? What would they have to do in order to maybe make the college football playoff? John, we'll talk about that in a couple moments right here on this crossover edition between the Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Mizzou podcasts. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks and the Locked On Mizzou podcast, where we cover the South Carolina Gamecocks and Missouri Tigers in 30 minutes or less on every one of our shows. All right, John, let's talk big picture here. The Missouri Tigers, I think it's fair to say expectations definitely been heightened after what all they did this past season. Return a lot of big pieces on offense. More than likely, we'll find some guys to step up on defense heading into the year. And the schedules you mentioned seems to line up pretty well. So if the Tigers want to make the college football playoff, outside of obviously winning the entire conference, which would get them an automatic bid, what do they have to do in order to accomplish that goal?
I think it's 10-2 or better. I really do. And it does matter, of course, who the 2 losses are, who the 10 wins are. But just for example, for example, for you South Carolina fans, let's say South Carolina takes down Mizzou, but they beat everybody else on the schedule except for Alabama. I still think that's a team that gets into the playoff, because for all the talk of, and there's been a lot of it in SEC scheduling quarters, the opponents of Missouri, such an easy schedule. Again, I'm with you in terms of relativity. It could certainly have been a lot harder for Missouri. South Carolina's schedule is harder. Totally agree. Florida's schedule, especially the non-con, is absolute murder's row. It's insanity. So, Yes, it could have been worse. No question about it. But I think it's still challenging enough. You're talking projected a top 30 schedule nationally. If you think about how the structure of the playoff is going to work, you see the top 4 teams, it's going to be the top 4 conference winners. So it's going to be one SEC team, one Big Ten team, for instance. How that's all going to play off at the end of it, if it's Missouri is 10, 11, 12, somewhere in that range, well, they're going to be compared to a lot of teams in the Big 12, for example, in the ACC, for example. Well, there isn't a single team in the Big 12 conference, for example, that has a projected schedule that is harder than Missouri. So if Missouri were in the Big 12, another way of saying that, they would have the hardest schedule in the Big 12. So that's why I keep trying to just put some context here, not make excuses for Missouri or anything.
Right.
I'm just telling you, 10-2 in the SEC, that's probably going to get the job done. I'll admit, though, if they go 9-3, I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, and I think you make a great point, John, when you compare that to, you say, the other conferences. And I think it's a big reason why a lot of people suspect that eventually it will become 2 super conferences in college football because, you know, I mean, you look at just the conference schedules by themselves. Like, you know, Missouri, still one of the toughest schedules in the sport. You said, what, about 24th, 25th, something to that effect? You know, tougher than most of the other schedules in, say, you know, the Big 12 and obviously the ACC. South Carolina fans love to give Clemson fans crap about that all the time, saying y'all don't have to play a schedule that we got to deal with every single year. So I think that with all that being said, I agree with you. I think if Missouri just gets to 10 wins, it's going to be really doggone hard to keep them out unless they just have 2 inexplicable losses potentially on the resume. But 9 wins, admittedly, might be a bit more difficult to pass on by. But with all that being said, John, thank you so much for coming on to today's show. If you're looking for more content on the Missouri Tigers, you can, of course, find Locked On Mizzou on YouTube or wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. And for all of you Tiger fans, maybe looking for info on the Gamecocks, you could do the same thing over here as well. But we appreciate all of you South Carolina Gamecock and Missouri Tiger fans for watching or listening to today's show. Have a great rest of your day. We'll be sure to catch you on our next respective shows of the Locked On Gamecocks and Locked On Mizzou podcast.